In the light of the outcome, I wouldn't say this is a scary story per se. Some terrifying, unforgettable things happened, but in the end they were all for the better. I have always loved drawing, ever since I can remember. It was the first thing anyone said I was good at. Throughout my school years, I would draw portraits for friends or draw pictures of their favourite cartoon characters. Sometimes I would even do them in exchange for sweets or some coins, which I would spend at the school canteen. In my senior years of high school, I even won some local competitions and had my pictures on display at local art festivals. This all changed, however, when I finished school and entered university. Under the insistence of my parents and teachers, art was not a guaranteed way to make a living for a young woman in this day and age. I gave up my hopes of becoming a children's book illustrator and instead enrolled in an accounting course at Sheffield University. By the end of my first year, I had decided I hated it. The career opportunities were good, and there was the prospect of working abroad, but I found the subject dull and uninspiring. But under the weight of expectation, I felt I had no choice but to stick to it. Though I still drew, it felt like nothing more than clutching at a pipe dream. At the time, I was living alone in a small one-bedroom flat in town. One day after returning home, I saw my home phone had a message on the answering service. The message I heard would change the course of my life for good. North Sheffield Primary School Reunion, Saturday the 22nd, 4 p.m. That's all it said. The line sounded very bad, staticky, and the voice was flat. It was a girl's voice. Through the static, the voice sounded very young, like a child. Of course, at the time I paid this no mind, but was instead filled with joy and excitement at the prospect of seeing all my old classmates. Soon after, on that same night, I called Stacy. She and I went to the same primary school and on to the same secondary schools. We still kept in touch. "Yeah," she said, "I got it too." I asked if she intended on going. "Absolutely, wouldn't miss that," she said. We talked for a while and I learned that she had recently acquired her driver's license. She said she couldn't rent a car and we could go together on the 22nd. This suited me fine, and so we made plans. Stacy picked me up around 2 in the afternoon of the 22nd. We spent the trip talking about old friends and times, and each grew a little melancholy at hearing how much all of our lives had changed since then. Our trip took us deep into a wooded mountain, the sun barely shimmering through the thick trees in the late autumn light. Still, it felt so good to be going to this reunion. "Whose idea was this?" I asked her, recalling the childlike voice on the answering machine. "The phone call I got didn't say who it was." "Same," Stacy replied. "Mine just said the date and time, then gave me the address." Funny, I thought. Mine just gave me the date and time. "Oh, here we are," said Stacy. The GPS beeped and announced our arrival. The road was a dead end. On one side the land rose steep into the mountain ridge. On the other was a decrepit church. We looked at each other and got out. "This has to be the wrong place," I remember Stacy saying. At first I thought the reunion might have been held in the church, but it was too old and looked to have been uninhabited for decades. It was surrounded by a graveyard. Tombstones jutted from the long grass like rotted teeth from the mouth of a decaying corpse. "Let's go back to the turn-off and try again," I suggested. "The GPS might be wrong." Around 20 minutes later, the GPS announced our arrival at the exact same place. "I'll try calling the rental company," Stacy said, in the hope that they could somehow remotely fix any abnormality in the GPS system. She hung up the phone without saying a word. "No reception up here," she said. I tried with my phone too, but to no success. It was past 4 p.m. and the light was fading. Our only other option, if we wanted to attend the party before it finished, was to head back into town and ask for directions. We drove for what seemed like too long, each bend in the mountain road looking identical to the last. The road seemed to rise in places, fall in others, but we didn't seem to be making any progress towards town. We soon grew despondent. "Do you want to just leave?" Stacy asked wearily. She looked tired from driving and making it nowhere. A wave of disappointment flooded over me. In the midst of a thoroughly unfulfilling and lonely academic lifestyle, I thought this event would be just what I needed. "I guess," I resigned. "It's already 5:30. The early dusk light of the mountains made me feel claustrophobic. After a few moments of silence passed, Stacy asked, Plus, don't you think it's weird that there was no letter with the call? I mean, for a reunion there's usually an announcement in the mail," she continued, suddenly looking quite uncomfortable. "Who was it that called, anyway?" she asked. She stopped the car on the side of the road, then took out her phone. "This is the message I got," she said as she passed me the phone. "Is that the same voice? Do you know whose it is?" I pressed the playback button. "Sheffield North Primary School reunion, Saturday 22nd, 4 p.m, it said. "Yes, that's the same as mine, but I don't know the voice of—" I was cut off by a sudden violent burst of static through the phone. There was a voice behind the static. It was very faint. We both heard it but couldn't make out what it was saying. "The message didn't continue like this before," Stacy told me. I shook my head in agreement. Then the static stopped and the voice became clear. "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts." It was the same voice as before, as if on a loop. It sounded mechanical and devoid of any emotion, almost robotic. "What is that?" Stacy cried. The fear in her expression was palpable. "I don't know." Panic rose in my voice. "I can't turn it off." I mashed the hang-up icon, then the off button, but it wouldn't respond. "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts." Stacy snatched her phone from my hands and started clawing at the battery case on the back. "It hurts. It hurt." She ripped the battery from the phone and tossed both onto the back seat. We sat there for a few moments trying to process what had just happened. Our shoulders heaved, our lungs breathless with panic and fear. We leaned back into our seats. "What was that?" she asked between breaths. "Let's just get out of here," I said. "This is too weird." We sat like that for a few more minutes, trying to regain our composure. The forest on either side was no longer visible past the first few meters or so of trees. Beyond that, just a swamp of branches and leaves. I turned my head to look out the passenger side window and saw her immediately. There was a girl, very young, wearing a white one-piece gown, standing within the murk of trees just beyond the side of the road opposite the car. Through the matted strands of dark hair covering her face, she was looking straight at us. Dumbstruck and paralyzed with fear, I swatted Stacy on the arm, never taking my eyes off of the girl in the trees. I felt Stacy turn to look out of the window too. I didn't see her reaction to what I was looking at, but I heard it. She whimpered. Then we both heard it again. Not from the phone this time, but from a very close distance, perhaps even inside our heads. "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts." We both flinched and screamed. The girl started to walk towards us with nightmare slowness, the voice getting louder with her every step. Stacy scrambled for the keys in the ignition and wrenched them on. The engine turned over once, twice, then fell dead. Stacy whimpered again. The girl was now close enough to make out several gashes in the chest of her gown. Through the tears could be seen long dark cuts, gnarled and dried hard with red and black blood, and the purple bruises, strangle marks ran across either side of her neck. Her eyes looked tired and desperate. Stacy and I were both screaming. I covered my ears and bent forward, but I could still hear it. "It hurts. It hurts." The car mercifully sprang to life and with a screech of rubber on asphalt sped off. We were a mess of quivering sobs, tears and burning lungs. The voice had stopped, but we didn't slow down, not even for the stop sign at the foot of the mountain, where its winding road meets the main road into town. We stopped at the first rest spot we came across, and sat in the car park. Stacy was first to speak. "Should we call the police?" she asked. I nodded. "We might have to. What else can we do?" She slumped forward, resting her head on the steering wheel, and sighed long and deep. I suggested we may have to use the rest stop's phone because mine showed no reception. Stacy then reached over her seat to retrieve her phone and battery off the floor. She hesitated before touching it. She seemed repulsed by it. Instead, she picked up the photo album on the back seat. We had flipped through it on the way, trying to remember old names and faces. I wonder if there was even any reunion in the first place, she mused aloud as she opened the album to a random spread of photos. I glanced over at a few of the photos. It was like a punch right in the heart. "Emily," I said. "Huh?" It was Emily. "Who's Emily?" I pointed to a girl in the back row of one of the class group photos. A look of recognition bled across Stacy's face. That was her, I said. It was definitely her. Emily, Stacy thought. But she died, right? In the 6th grade? In fact, Emily had been killed by her mother in a murder-suicide, strangled and stabbed to death. We didn't call the police and instead decided on paying a visit to Emily's father, whom we hoped still lived in the same house in North Sheffield. We sat in silence during the drive back. We were both thinking the same thing, but neither dared to say it. Emily's childhood home still stood where it did 8 years ago. A car was parked in the driveway and there were lights on inside. Stacy turned off the engine and we sat in the dark opposite the house. "What are we even going to say?" she asked, a hint of hopelessness in her voice. To be honest, I didn't even know. How can we tell a man who in all sense is probably still grieving the loss of his 11-year-old daughter at the hands of his ex-wife that we had seen her just hours ago on a deserted mountain road? But for some reason this felt like the right thing to do. He could call us insane, or accuse us of playing a sick joke, but nevertheless I felt we had to tell him. A middle-aged woman wearing an apron answered the door. "Good evening, yes?" she said, wiping her hands down the front of her apron. I clumsily blurted out the first intelligible thing that came to mind. "Good evening. Is the father of a girl who was called Emily living here?" The woman first eyed us suspiciously, then told us to wait while she got him. The three of us sat in the living room chatting idly. Photos of Emily adorned the walls and shelves. The woman who greeted us at the door came in with tea. "I've since remarried," he said. He looked very old but seemed in good spirits. We told him we were invited to a reunion which was to be held on Mount Blackmore. His eyes lit up. "That's where Emily is," he paused. "Sleeping now." Stacy and I eyed each other numbly. "There's a small church up there. Emily's grandmother, my mother, is buried there too," he said, smiling warmly. "Lovely views out over the whole valley on a nice day." I pretended to sip the tea. "How was the reunion then?" he continued. Stacy and I shared another glance at each other. "Oh," I said, "we never made it in the end." "Yes," Stacy added, "we got lost on the way up and—" "Oh my," he said, "that is a shame, isn't it? There's nothing like a good school reunion to lift the spirits." Neither one of us were willing to tell him what had happened, how we saw his daughter and the state she appeared to us in. I thought of a ruse. "We have been thinking about Emily and actually we came here to give you a present," I told him. "Oh, you did?" he beamed. "How lovely. But you really didn't have to come all this—" "Stacy," I said, putting down my tea, "do you think you could go out and get the photo album from the car?" She seemed more than happy to. As she left the room, he got up and started for the living room door. "Actually, I've got something you might like to see too," he said. I felt the fool. This poor man, I thought. Stacy returned with the album and Emily's father came back into the room, holding what looked like a large scrapbook. "She kept all of these," he said, opening the book on the table. The pages were filled with sketches stuck there with glue. I recognized some as my own. I used to sign my name on them. "She loved your drawings," he said, smiling warmly at the sketches. "Do you still draw?" he asked me. "Well," I began, "I've not got much time with my studies and all, but when I can find the time, I try to." "And so you should," he shouted. "Don't waste a talent like this." He rubbed his hand over a portrait I drew of Emily. His eyes softened. Stacy gave him the photo album, but he refused to accept it, as did I when he offered me the portrait of Emily. Feeling we had more than overstayed our welcome, we headed back out to the car. I lay awake in my flat that night. I kept thinking about the reason Emily would have revealed herself like that to me. What was she trying to tell me? A few days later I announced to the dean I was taking a year off from my course to pursue another interest. I like to believe that Emily revealed herself in order for me to realize what I really wanted to do with my life. I enrolled at a visual arts college in London, where I'll be doing what I love for the next 10 months at least. Then I'll see where it leads. I never used to believe in ghosts. Then this happened. After my mother's passing, I moved back to my hometown to support my father, who had health issues of his own. Janitorial work being the only work I have ever done since graduating from high school. There was no choice as to what job I would pick up while back home. I considered myself lucky to have found a cleaning job at a nursery school about 30 minutes' drive from the house. The previous janitor, as I heard in the interview, suddenly quit a week previously, citing immediate health concerns. Over the next week of working there, I got a pretty concrete idea as to what caused those immediate health concerns. Things started getting weird on the second or third day from when I started. It was at night, about 2 hours after the preschool had closed, around 8 p.m. I was mopping the floors on the first floor near the reception area when the intercom for the front gate rang. I was the only person in the building at that hour, so I had to answer it. I picked up after a few rings and heard only static. I looked out of the reception office window, which looks out onto the car park and front gate, but no one was there. So I decided to walk out and take a look in case they hadn't heard me answer or something. But not a soul was around. At the time I put it down to some kids playing knock and run, or just faulty wiring. The very next night I had another late night intercom call come through. This time I was on the 3rd level mopping the corridor. The phone in the corridor rang, but the weird thing was that only that particular phone rang, the one closest to me. I couldn't hear any others ringing. This is a detail I overlooked at the time, as I just assumed all the phones in the building were connected to the reception area and front gate, and they would automatically be diverted to where the sensors picked up activity in the building, similar to the lights and heating. Same as the night before, I was met with static. Then as I removed the phone from my ear to hang up, I heard a voice. A woman's voice. It sounded very far away and I couldn't get what she was saying at first, so I asked her to repeat it. "Is my son there?" she said slowly. Slower than was necessary, I felt. It sounded like the person on the other end was underwater. "The nursery shuts at 6 p.m, ma'am, and there were no kids here when it did," I replied. No answer from her end, just a rise in the static. Receiver still in hand, I looked out of the corridor window on the opposite side, the one that looks directly over the car park. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm having trouble hearing you." There was no one at the gate. Then her voice through the phone again said, "Is my son there?" I strained to look at the gate, almost willing someone to materialize, just so I wasn't looking at a space where there should have been the person I was talking to. "Ma'am, I can't hear—" Then the phone went to static again. At the time, honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. I hadn't just imagined a voice, that's for sure. It was clear as day. But I just shrugged it off. Weird people are everywhere in this world. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of bare feet running on hardwood floor. The feet were light and quick. Children's feet. They came from the 4-year-old's room and out into the stairwell, where they suddenly stopped. I called out to the empty corridor. "Hello?" No response. Whoever it was, they were waiting in the stairwell, just behind the corner. I took a few steps forward to the stairwell, off to the side of the corridor, then the footsteps started again, this time running down the stairs before fading out of earshot entirely. Someone, a child, ran out from the 4-year-old's room on the 3rd floor, hid in the stairwell, waited, then when I approached, ran down to another floor. That is what happened, and I swear by that. I called out again and made after the child. How could they have overlooked a child left here past 6 o'clock? Had they been hiding somewhere in the room this whole time? How come the sensor lights didn't turn on? All these questions raced through my mind as I took pursuit of the child. The 2nd floor was silent, and what's more, none of the lights had been activated by the motion sensor until I arrived there. The same went for the stairwell. I checked in both of the rooms, but there was no sign of the child. Then as I was walking back out into the stairwell, I heard one of the faucets in the toilets turn on. I say turned on, but it was more like wrenched full bore. There were no lights from the toilet area either. The lights turned on when I entered the toilets, to only reveal an empty room. The tap had been turned on with such force that I had to strain to turn it off, and there was no chance in hell a child could have done that. I called the headmaster using the phone in the reception office, and told him I had heard a child running around on the 3rd and 2nd floors. I didn't mention the faucet in the toilet, and that the sensor lights were unable to pick up any movement. Well, as I expected, my story was met with disbelief. I was asked, "Are you sure?" 3 times. I told him that I was just telling him what I'd heard, and that I didn't actually see anything. He told me to leave and that he'd send someone over at once to double-check and also check the lighting system. I offered to wait in case the child showed itself again, but my offer was refused. I collected my equipment from the 3rd floor, put it back in the janitor's locker, and locked the building for the night. The next day the headmaster called me into his office. He told me that after a thorough search of the entire building and grounds, there was no trace of any child. He also added that the intercom and lighting systems were in working order. The building was nearly 30 years old, he said. A building of its age is prone to making noises at all hours. It's just in the daytime they aren't as noticeable. There was something in his face, though. Concern, maybe? Not at the possibility that there was a child in the building alone after dark, but that his new janitor from out of town might be insane. Even if there were a possibility that the noises I mistook for footsteps were actually the aches and creaks of an aging building, there was no imagining the tap that turned itself on with such force I had trouble turning it back off. That was not a symptom of an old building. Those few happenings, though, were just the start. That night there was another incident. I use the word incident because I can't think of another name, but I guess a spiritualist might use the word manifestation. It was around 9 p.m. and I was on the 1st floor reception area, filling out the daily sheet, ready to leave for the day. Then I heard the sound of something bouncing, like a large rubber ball. It was getting closer and it was coming from the stairwell. A yellow ball bounded down the stairs and out onto the 1st floor. Its bouncing subsided and it rolled straight at me. It stopped about an inch from my foot, but it was the way it stopped. It didn't stop for lack of forward momentum. It stopped abruptly, as if stopped by a hidden hand. It took me probably longer than it should have done to process what had just happened. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. For some reason I couldn't bring myself to bend down and pick the ball up. I couldn't bear the thought of doing so and finding the ball to be warm. I should have just gone home, but instead I headed up the stairs. The 1st floor, the infant level, then to the toddlers' rooms on the 2nd floor. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing misplaced, lights working fine. The 3rd floor, however, was anything but. Ascending the stairs, I felt a significant drop in the temperature between the floors. The 3rd floor was freezing, and there was a strange smell, one that had never been there before, like a shoreline, a rotten one, a sandy, salty, rotting marine life smell. The thermostat on the corridor read 28 degrees. This was the constant room temperature setting for the entire building. It couldn't be increased either. Inside the 4-year-old's room was even colder. I could see plumes of steam in front of me every time I exhaled, but I noticed no condensation on the windows. Then I heard the same noise as I had on the 1st floor, a bouncing ball. This time, too, it was getting close. It was bouncing up the stairs. Some impulse told me to conceal myself from the view of the stairwell opposite the room. I pressed my back up against the wall next to the room's door, and the ball bounced into the room, past where I was standing flat against the wall. It stopped at a spot in the centre of the room, still bouncing. It gradually slowed until it stopped and came to rest on the floor. I could do nothing other than stand and watch. What would you have done if that had happened to you? There isn't much else you can do. There was a terrible passing of time, a heavily pregnant pause in the air. The wall at my back threatened to freeze me. The cold was now both in the room and inside myself. After a few minutes, maybe even 10, the ball started to slowly roll towards me again. It stopped just before my toes. I was frozen with fear and disbelief, like I was in someone else's nightmare, being forced to experience it without having control over when I could wake up. As carefully as I could, I slid along the small space of wall at my back toward the door. Meanwhile, the ball remained motionless. I felt that if I'd made any sudden quick movements, it would spring to life again. Out in the corridor, I became immediately aware of him. A small boy, perhaps 5 years old, stood naked, save for a pair of white underpants. He was very pale, his skin almost grey. His eyes were very much alive, though. They stared mutely at me. He was definitely a physical being, but it was the marks on his body that to this day make my blood chill when I recall him. Around either side of his neck were long, blue-black bruises, 4 on each side. His stomach was crisscrossed with what looked like burn scars from something thin and long. The corner of one of his grey lips was swollen and black. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to sound as casual as I could. I know how silly it must seem now, but trust me, at the time I thought him real. Real as in physically there. Tangible. The apparition, because I know that's what it was now, stared blankly at me. "Why are you still here?" I asked, injecting as much caring into my voice as possible, while trying not to turn tail and run for as long as I could. His skin was so pale and his eyes were exhausted and sunken, but definitely regarding me. From behind me the hall telephone rang. Startled, I swung around, and when I turned back, the boy had disappeared, and the ball inside the room was gone too. The phone continued to ring on the wall. I couldn't say what sick impulse spurred me to answer the phone, but I picked it up. A part of me knew what I was likely to hear, and sure enough it came. That same voice. "Is my son there? I want you to give me my son." "Excuse me?" I asked, not really expecting a reply. I looked out of the window overlooking the front gate, hoping to see someone standing by the intercom. There was no one in sight, and the gate was wide open. Slamming the receiver back down, I raced for the stairs, but as I did I heard the sound of one of the closet doors in the classroom slam shut with terrible force. Was the child back? The room was just as freezing as it had been moments before, and the smell was stronger. I opened the closet door to find the same little boy hiding in one corner, his skinny little legs drawn up to his chest. He looked terrified. "You okay, little guy?" I asked. From behind me wafted that smell again. It was thick like a current. It nearly made me retch. The boy turned his focus away from me, and to a point behind me. He cringed and turned as far into the corner as he could. Then a voice from just behind my back appeared. It was the exact same voice as the one on the phone, and it sounded close, but had that same watery distortion as on the intercom phone. "Give him to me." Every hair on my body stood on end, and I turned around. I was now facing a woman. Well, it was once a woman, I imagine. Before her current, how should I put it, state. She was soaked, her hair matted in thick strands which stuck to her face. Her skin, what could be seen of it anyway through her clothing, was as pale as the boy's, but it was wrinkled and silvery, like the belly of a fish. She slowly opened her mouth, and inside I could see a swollen black tongue. Her teeth were caked in something green and slimy looking. Her mouth didn't move though, and I heard the same line as before, coming from somewhere inside that mouldy sewer pipe mouth. Then a thick green black ooze spilled slowly from it. I could smell it. I retched. Then from behind me in the closet the boy let out a scream, and it was full of panic and fear. It was as if my body had completely rejected what I was experiencing. Acting out of pure instinct, I sprang up and scrambled across the room, slipping on my own vomit. The boy's screams continued as I raced down the steps and out of the front gate. I could still hear them as I sped off in my car. I spent the night in my car. I don't know why. Perhaps because it was a small space and I could escape easily. I sat in the driver's seat until dawn, vainly trying to process what had just happened. Should I call the police? Should I go back and check on the boy? Should I call my boss? The answer to all of those questions was of course no. In the morning I told my boss I wouldn't be coming again, citing family reasons. He was sympathetic and strangely accommodating, as if he had expected this all along. As an afterthought, I asked him if there had ever been an accident at the school involving a parent and one of the kids. I figured I've already resigned, so what difference does it make? He said there was only one incident that he knows of, but it didn't happen in the school. One of the kids, he said, was found dead in their home one day. "Oh God," I said. He continued. This boy would turn up to school with bruises, cuts, and other obvious signs of physical abuse. I think he was also deprived of food because he was much skinnier than the other kids. Was he murdered? I asked. He nodded and looked pointedly at me. The mother, she strangled him. Christ, I felt sick. She was questioned by police but killed herself a few hours after being released. She drowned. Cowardly bitch jumped into the river. They should have let her body rot in the water after what she'd done. His phone then started to ring, which ended our conversation, but I had already heard enough. The boy is still constantly on my mind. I can still hear his screams from the night that I fled from the building. The only conclusion I can come to is that his spirit inhabits the preschool he attended. Perhaps he's hiding there from his mother, but as I found out, his mother knows where he is, and she comes back for him. Does that mean that he must relive his death at the hands of his wretched mother over and over? It's a horrible thought. And did he manifest himself to me in order to seek my help? I would love nothing more than to put his soul to rest, but I'll need help. Prior to 2016, I lived in Palmdale, California. My sister Honey and my youngest daughter lived with my mother in a rented townhouse apartment in Oxnard, about 2 hours away. Every week or two I'd make the long drive to take them shopping and clean their house, because they were both disabled. My mother was my heart, and my sweet sister helped raise me, so anything they needed I was there for them. On the first floor was the kitchen, in the back, with a door that opened to the backyard. Then there was a big open space through to the living room and the front door. On the right was the bathroom and my mother's bedroom, and the stairs were on the left with a half-wall railing going up to the first landing. My mum was sitting in her lift recliner on the right, facing the base of the stairs. One night we were all sitting in the living room watching a show with the lights on, and my daughter was upstairs in her room. We were laughing at something that we were watching on TV, when I saw something on the stairs. It darted down the steps really fast, then was peeking up at me. It then ducked down behind the railing. Following this was a cold chill that entered the living room. My mother commented that it was cold and pulled her robe together. At first I thought it was my daughter playing tricks on me, but when she didn't pop up I felt concerned. I asked my mum, as she was in full sight of the area. "Mama, did you see something?" "No, dear, I thought I did, but there's nothing there," she said. That's when it hit me, and instinctively I knew what it was and where it had come from. I ran up the stairs and burst into my daughter's room. "What did you do?" I yelled at her. She looked at me with her eyes wide, and she knew exactly what I was referring to and started apologizing. I told her to tell me what she had done to bring it into this house. She then proceeded to tell me that when her girlfriends had been there, they thought it would be fun to summon a spirit. Then they tried to reach the father of one of her friends who'd passed away 2 years prior. But she said something else came through and it scared them, so they stopped and her friends ran home without even saying goodbye. Well, I was furious. "How dare you play with something you don't understand?" I told her. I told her that I knew she was just trying to help a friend, but for heaven's sake. I warned her years ago never to mess around with things she didn't understand and had no control over. I was thinking that not only do I constantly worry about my family's health, now I have to worry about this. I asked if she had at least closed the door, and she just looked at me with a blank stare, so obviously she hadn't. She had said they'd made a Ouija board out of paper, and when they were done she'd ripped it up and threw it away. That door had to be closed. We gathered the pieces and she called her friends. 2 of them were too scared to come back, so we had to perform the closing without them. But in the back of my head I knew that it didn't work, and it was still hiding there. At that point there was nothing I could have done viewing the circumstances at the time. Now fast forward to 2016. I had an opportunity waiting for me in Washington State, so I begged and pleaded for my mother and sister to go with me. But my sister Honey was fanatically scared of change, and although my mother desperately wanted to go with me, she couldn't leave my sister's side. I wish now I had been more persistent. So I moved, reluctantly leaving them with my daughter and her now husband to take over their care. Within those 2 years, my eldest sister Honey's health severely declined, and my mother then told me that 8 months after I'd moved away, that she had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I flew and drove back and forth to be with them, and every time I showed them the pretty pictures of my new life and our beautiful green surroundings, asking them to return with me. Every time, though, Honey would say that she was too apprehensive to leave and said no. By 2018, they had both passed away, my mother from cancer and my sister from an existing illness. They took a big part of my heart and soul with them. My daughter and her husband moved out, leaving all of my mother and sister's things there, so someone had to put all of their stuff into storage. And of course that someone had to be me. Even though I was the youngest of 6, I felt it was my duty. I drove there with my 2 grandchildren, ages 8 and 4, because at the time there was no one available to watch them. When we arrived, the place was in a shambles. There were dirty dishes with mouldy food lining the counters and were piled up in the sink. It also looked like there was soot all over the floor. Mum and Honey's personal belongings were strewn about the house, and in my mother's room there was a barricade of trash piled up all the way up to her door. In the middle of the floor in the open space was a full-length mirror that I had never seen before, hanging off of a wooden ladder. I just stood there and cried. I set up a clean spot in the living room for my grandson to play on his tablet, and my granddaughter wanted to help me, and as I was bagging things up in the kitchen, I noticed her just standing there staring into the mirror. I didn't think anything of it, but she kept standing there. Then I heard her say to me, whilst not looking away, "Nana, can you get rid of this mirror?" I thought she wanted me to move it, but she was adamant that it be taken out of the house completely. I asked her why she looked so scared, and she told me that while she was looking into the mirror, she was standing alone. She couldn't see anything in the reflection around or behind her. It was just darkness all around her, and something was coming. I looked over toward where the mirror was, and it did look very dark. I said no more. Not only did I take it outside, I smashed it into little pieces and threw it in the trash can. We decided to sleep in the living room that night. It took days to even come close to being done. So now we come to the last night, and we're all alone. I had just mopped downstairs, so I locked all the doors and windows in the whole house, and we slept upstairs in the bedroom across from my daughter's old room. We hunkered down on some mattresses on the floor, and I always left a light on in the hall. I'm reading a book online. My granddaughter had fallen asleep next to me, and my grandson was on his tablet at the end of the bed. I was getting sleepy, and my grandson started to yawn. He looked up from his tablet, and his eyes became wide. Then he ran to the door, shouting, "Spooky!" and slammed it shut. Running back, he quickly got under the covers and got as close to me as he could, making me feel very uneasy. I could see movement in the hall that was dimming the light around under the door. It was making strange, swirling shapes, as if someone were pacing, followed by surges of blackness and wisps of cool air coming from the space under the door. That was a long night, and I was on guard until I finally fell asleep as well. I woke up hours later and had to go to the bathroom, but I was too scared. I was trying to wait until daybreak, but I just couldn't wait any longer, so I slowly opened the door, fearing for what was waiting for me on the other side. But there was nothing. I could see that there was, though. I tried to be as fast as I could, and I left the bathroom door open so I could hear the kids. Then I ran back, hearing a swoosh behind me. I slammed the door and laid down, holding the kids until daybreak. I received a call from my sister later that morning. She couldn't understand how we had been able to stay in that house. When I asked her why, she told me that when she was there grabbing some boxes of pictures, she heard noises coming from my daughter's room upstairs. She said it was really loud and felt an evil presence, and everything inside her told her to leave, so she did. She also told me that my son-in-law, from which I had no knowledge of at the time, had been practicing black magic and summoning dark energy in that particular room. Not cool. Late that afternoon, everything was done. The kids were in the car, and the car was packed. I just wanted to look in my mother's bedroom one last time, to see where she used to sleep. These walls held so many memories, and I felt like if I looked hard enough, I would see her lying where the bed had been, and in my mind telling myself not to cry. As I stood in the doorway, a chill went up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck and my arms started to rise, and I could feel something closing in on me. In my ear, I felt a warm breath. and then I heard one loud word. It was run. I ran out of the house so fast I didn't even lock the door. As we were driving off, my granddaughter asked me who that was standing in the window upstairs. Warning. There is mention of animal abuse, but I assure you my little dog lived a full and happy life after this with me and my kids. At that time, thank goodness, my youngest was the only one with me, and my other 5 children were at Grandma's for the summer. Please keep in mind that this occurrence happened over 2 decades ago, and times were different back then. We had no cell phones or digital cameras, and the laws did not always go in the favour of the victim, like it does today. The only proof I have is the word of my now grown children and a few family members. This took place in my early 30s. I lived in a downstairs duplex in Lancaster, California at the time, with my son and my little 6-pound wire-haired Yorkie Terrier named Gizmo. My son's father was once again in prison for a number of things, and I would faithfully wait for him to get out from long stretches at a time, over and over, only to have him do something else selfish and stupid, landing him right back in there again. He was a regular on a first-name basis. After receiving a letter mailed to me, but meant for another, saying things like, "My son's mother has no idea we have been seeing each other, but she takes care of me in here, so I don't want to tell her yet," I told him, that was it, I was done. Even though I didn't think so at the time, I look at pictures back then and think that I was not a bad looker, and I could have been with anybody, but I wasted those years with him. I was pretty much raising our son by myself anyway. It took me about 4 months to get on my feet enough where I felt comfortable enough to even think about seeing someone else, and that is when I met him, Robert. He was good-looking, kind, and he had a job in welding. He was in the same circle of friends as me, and that's how we met. In fact, he told them that he felt like it was love at first sight. I had never been the type to let anyone meet my kids unless I thought they were special. And boy, this one felt special all right. Everything about him was perfect, pinch me perfect. He dropped off a cup of coffee every morning on his way to work and brought me a single flower when he came home, even if it was picked from a yard. I'm not one for gifts or compliments, but Southern charm always got me. It reminded me of home. I called my mother and told her all about him, and she was so happy for me, she couldn't wait to meet him. So we had been dating for about 5 months, and he just kept wanting to move in with me. I thought about it but wasn't sure. Something just felt weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I made so many excuses. I mean, he'd known my son for 3 months, and my son still hadn't warmed up to him, which I thought was odd. Robert was trying so hard to get him to like him. One day my mum asked me if I could make the long drive out to Oxnard to look at her van. I did all the repairs on it, and she described what the van was doing, and it sounded like a bigger job than I'd anticipated. But like a knight in shining armour, he said that he had the tools and was willing to help me. Family meant everything to me, so that meant a lot. We started out early that day, and when we arrived we were met with smiling faces and that old-fashioned hospitality. We got the parts and started working on the van. It was nice to have help for a change. After we were done, we went in to clean up and get a bite to eat before heading back home. My mum, being her charming self, talked to him for a while and later pulled me aside and said, "I see why you fell for him, but do you ever feel like there is something off?" I didn't know what she was trying to say. She didn't even know either, so I said that I would pay more attention and left it at that. I mean, there were little things, but no real red flags. Well, we were just about to leave, and my son said that he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay for a while with the other kids in the family. I saw no harm in it, as he really didn't have friends or school at his age. So 2 weeks, that's it, I told him. As I kissed him goodbye, he asked me to be careful and not die. What a strange thing for a little guy like him to say, I thought. So I asked what he meant, and he said, "Just don't die. Love you, Mama. Bye." And ran back into the house. Okay, I won't. When we got back home, he started coming over more often, bringing dinner and movies, and just treating me better than I'd been treated in a very long time. One night, and I remember it like yesterday, I had him and some friends over, and I made dinner. After the last guest had left, he stood in front of me and got down on his knees and professed his love, and I fell for it, hook, line and sinker. He sounded so genuine, I agreed to let him move in. Stupid, stupid, stupid. That next morning he moved his stuff in, and I thought it was very strange that he only had 3 boxes to his name. They were black chests with locks, and that was it. He didn't unpack them either. They were just there. Of course he had some bags for his clothes, but nothing more. From that very first day he started acting differently. I wasn't the only one who noticed it either. He started fighting with his boss, who drove him to work every day, so needless to say he was off work for a bit. And his looks? Drastically his looks changed. Like freaky weird, almost like he aged 10 years in almost 2 weeks, right down to thinning hair and a bit of a belly. Then he started to get a short temper about nothing. Petty stuff. I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. I called my mother and asked her to keep my son a little longer, because this was tripping me out. I was beside myself, but I didn't know how to get out of this without pissing him off. My dog was even scared of him all of a sudden. I told all this to one of my oldest friends, and he thought he would just pop in to see for himself. Boy, was he ever surprised at Robert's quick transformation and his behaviour. There was something about those black boxes, and I don't intrude upon anyone's privacy, but I got a glimpse of one of them, and he had everything in little compartments and baggies. Not in a neat freak way, but over-the-top type creepy obsessive. He even wiped his mouth with a napkin, then rolled it up, put it into a Ziploc bag, then zip-tied it and put it in the chest and locked it. What did I get myself into? I had to figure this out. I asked him if I could take him out to eat so we could talk, and he agreed, but he wanted to pick the restaurant. He picked a place a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. We were almost there when he told me to pull down this street, because he had a surprise for me. He wanted me to meet his family. We got out and went to the door, and he knocked. Someone looked out the window and quickly closed the blinds and turned out the light. We stood there for a minute, and I told him that we should leave. But now he's getting testy. He bangs on the door harder, yelling that he knows they are in there. I started to walk to the car, but he told me in a stern voice to get back here. This scared me, so I did what I was told. Just so you know, I was 5'1" and he was 6'3". He turned back to the door and yelled that they didn't want to get him mad, so just then the door cracks open. He puts his arm around me and guided me in, saying, "Hello, sis," like nothing happened. "Where's that pussy husband of yours?" This man called out from the living room, "I'm right here, Robert." His sister then asked him what he was doing there, and said that she didn't want any trouble. He just laughed and introduced me as his girlfriend. Hearing that, even the kids came out to look at me like they were in disbelief or something. He went to the refrigerator and just grabbed a beer like he owned the place, and I noticed her hand was shaking as she greeted me. These people were visibly scared to death of him, but I didn't know why. At one point his sister must have put a note in my jacket that I found later, and it read, "You need to know. Please don't let him know I gave you my number. He will kill me." We stayed for a short time, when I reminded him that we had prior plans. The looks I got from his family when he wasn't looking almost made me feel like they were scared for me. Well, needless to say, we left, went to a restaurant and ate, and I didn't bring up anything that night. After that he became angry a lot, rude to my friends. It was like he wanted me alone, but only mainly after I'd got him my paycheck. A while passed living on eggshells. My friend was over again, and I told him that my dog was acting strangely. It seemed like every time I went anywhere and left her alone with Robert, she'd poop on the floor, and he said he reprimands her. I told him that I didn't feel safe, and it was as like he was planning something. I was scared to confront the guy, so my friend came up with a plan. He said we should make an excuse to go somewhere, and he would leave a recording device under the couch, and we could hear if he called anyone or had anyone over. I didn't care much for the idea of spying on him, but my options were limited. He set the device off, and to the store we went. We were gone about 45 minutes, and when we got back he was pissed. He was yelling about how my dog had pooped on the carpet, and she had bitten his hand. There was blood drops on my floor. I asked him where she was, but all he told me was that he put her outside. We didn't have a gated yard, so I ran outside to look for her. I looked and looked, calling her name, and I finally found her all the way in the back by the carports under some trash. She had pooped all over herself, including a little blood. The second I pulled her out of the trash, she was hiding in my arms, and she tried to cry, but her voice was raspy, and she whimpered at every touch. Her whole body was uncontrollably shaking. I held her close and ran from the carport back into the apartment. Robert looked shocked that I had come in holding her, and the moment she saw him, she tried to burrow her way into my chest while screaming. "What did you do to her?" I yelled. He threw the broom down and yelled back that he didn't do anything. He said that I left, she pooped, he swatted her and put her out, and that was it. That definitely was not it. He was angry and said he wasn't going to be treated like this, so he stormed off, leaving my friend and myself just standing there in shock. I took little Gizmo into the bathroom to calm her down and clean her up, and noticed popped blood vessels in her eye. Then I heard a gasp and a, "Oh my God, no," coming from the living room. My friend was listening to what had been recorded. He locked the front door and came into the bathroom with tears streaming down his face. That monster. We listened to the tape huddled on the bathroom floor. On the tape we heard the door shut as we left, then the car drive away. Then Robert said, "They're gone. Now you're going to die." You could hear him grab my little 6-pound Gizmo and start beating her. The recording of her screams echoed in the bathroom as the beating continued for a while. She must have pooped herself in fear and bit his hand, and that's when he must have started choking her. Then he opened the door and you could hear him throw her out, yelling at her not to come back. Then the door shut and he muttered, "One down, a few more to go." Oh my God. All I could do at that point was rock little Gizmo and cry. My friend and I agreed that we weren't going to let him get away with this. We took her down to the sheriff's station and played the tapes, but they said they didn't know what they were listening to, so they dismissed us. They said that the dog had no broken bones, so she could have easily been attacked by something or hit by a car when he put her out. If we had more tangible evidence, they would look into it. I then told them that it was my house and I wanted him out because I didn't feel safe, but the officer told me that at that point I was making it up to get my boyfriend out because I was mad at him, and if I wanted him to leave, I needed to evict him by court order. We were on our own. I remembered his sister giving me her number, so we sat in the sheriff's parking lot and I called. She told me to lose her number and said that she was putting herself at risk for even giving it to me. I begged her. I told her what happened. She didn't sound surprised. She told me to get away from him. She said that he'd gotten out of prison a year prior for multiple murders, and he was evil. Then she hung up. My friend told me that I shouldn't be alone with him, and I agreed. It disgusted me to look at him. I wanted to kill him, but I had to get him out. The only thing my friend and I could think of was to tell our friends to come over and never leave me be alone with him. Having so many people over made him crazy. He even charged after some friends outside with a knife, and they hit him with their car. He still didn't leave. I remember him bandaging his bloody head, saying, "This is your fault, and you'll pay." Just so you know, I kept Gizmo in an arm sling on me at all times. I noticed that he hated it when people touched his black cases, so we kept moving them from room to room every time. Eventually he left and said he couldn't even think, and took his 3 locked chests and his clothes. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I didn't feel safe. I packed up and my friends helped me move. It was the last night and the last bit of stuff, and my friend went to drop off the truck, so I was alone. I was just sweeping the floor when I heard a knock at the door. I started to open it when I stopped and looked out of the peephole. The porch light had been unscrewed, so I couldn't see anyone. "Who is it?" I said. Then the reply, "You know who this is." I told him to go away, and that's when he broke in through my window and started to climb into my home. At this point I was screaming. He grabbed this big knife off of the counter and stabbed my TV and kicked it over. Then he went for my throat. He was practically on top of me, and I was fighting with everything I had, when suddenly the door was kicked in by 2 sheriffs, hearing my screams, and they grabbed him off of me. Apparently, as my friends were returning, they saw him approach the house and unscrew the light bulb, so they drove across the street to a payphone and called the cops. The sheriffs were driving down the street and saw him break in and climb in the window. After that time, my internal barriers went up, and I had a hard time trusting anyone new after that. Years and years later, I saw him at a gas station, and he recognized me. I wanted to run, but I was pumping gas. He walked right up to me, and I was fearing for the worst. He said he was sorry, and he said he found God and has a wife of 8 years. Just then he waved to this lady in the car to come out and meet an old friend. She walked up and extended her hand. It was like one of those moments in time, you know? All the scenarios went off in my head. Things I wanted to say, things I wanted to do to him for hurting my little gizmo and messing with my life. But I didn't. I shook her hand, not even saying one word to him. I got in my car and drove away, leaving them both standing there. Just so you know, Gizmo had no permanent damage except for the redness in her left eye that was a constant reminder of that day. She lived with me and my children happily for 4 more years until she passed away from old age. For those of you who don't believe this happened, it did. My children remember this event vividly and told me after the fact that they never liked him. My friends also told me later that he would give me hateful looks when he thought no one was looking, and that's what told them something was wrong. I have lived a long life and made some very bad choices, but I will tell you this: there are evil people out there. Thank God laws have changed to protect us now.